Hey guys, Kisses here, and today we're going to talk about how I made my Ariel cosplay. So Ariel is one of my favorite Disney princesses, and quite surprisingly, I never cosplayed her until now. So we'll be going over all the details of how I start to finish made this cosplay. So I started by using the Simplicity 8330 skirt as the base, and we took out these certain pattern pieces to make the skirt. Then once we had all the pattern pieces laid out, making sure that we match each one for the pieces we picked, we then are going to trace the pattern pieces onto our tracing paper. This allows us to keep the original sewing pattern in the proper condition, and it allows us to then make modifications easily onto the drafting paper. So this is called Swedish tracing paper. It's sewable, but it does tear very easily. So I'm able to put pins in it. And as you can see, once we get it completely lined up with the grooves of our instructional paper, we can then trace it. So I trace the measurement that I need exactly, so that I'm copying all the darts, all of the notations, all of the pull lines, and my fold lines here. So this is before we make any modifications. So I'm just going to trace out the items that we need. So then once we traced out all of our pattern pieces, we're going to cut the pattern. Once we have the pattern pieces cut out, we're going to make them a mock-up. So just like you would with regular fabric or muslin, you're going to use sewing pins to kind of put together a paper version of your item, and this will then help you figure out what you need to modify without wasting that precious fabric.
It's definitely too big.
So here am I tracing it, and I'm seeing how far tall it is in comparison. So this is now me making some adjustment lines, putting in the line for the abdomen for the fin, and adding some extra paper to the end so that I can add it in for the additional length. So we have modified our first piece. So now we're going to retrace the draft piece. So this is where we take the draft piece and put over another piece of the drafting paper. So as you can see here, I pinned another piece of drafting paper over our first mock-up, and now I'm tracing that out to be the correct size. And once we have our pattern already done, we then add in those extra seam allowances, and we're making sure that our seams are correct. Once I'm happy with our paper mock-up, I then move into the muslin mock-up. I like to trace this onto some cheap muslin that's going to have a similar feel and drape to how the fabric actually sits. So since this is going to be a pretty tight forming costume, I am tracing it. And I like to use a Sharpie for this because it's just going to get thrown away, and then it lets me visibly see easily the seams. Since this is just a mock-up, we can do a long basting stitch. So now we're testing our mock-up. As you can see, it needs to be taken in several places. I went ahead and had pins put in the side, and we were able to then get a better form-fitting silhouette. I then like to trace this with the Sharpie on the fabric directly, so then I have my new lines. I then take those new lines and sew over them for the seam adjustment. You can see how wide that adjustment was for the take-in.
Make sure your fabric is exactly where you want it for the fold, so it is even on both sides.
So now that we have our pattern all ready to go, we are ready to start cutting onto the main fabric. So the main fabric, since it is patterned with fish scale, you gotta make sure it is folded in the way that you want the pattern to be displayed. This is what it would look like mocked up on my feet. Making sure it's all lined up. We're going to be lining up with the back. So now that we have our two pieces of fabric, we're going to sandwich them together, and just like the mock-up, we're going to sew along those edges. since this fabric does have a slight stretch, instead of a basting stitch, we're going to be using a zigzag to prevent any uncurling of the thread as it moves on our body. Sewing the right side. And sewing the left side. And this is the tail body done. So it sits exactly where I need it to on my waist.
The fins, I put my pattern pieces together so I have my one long waist piece. I know it's going to separate in the back, so I just got to make a piece that connects to here, and I get to sketch it out now. Yay!
So we're going to make a mock-up for the waist piece. The waist piece was definitely an engineered piece, and I ended up going with this triangle tube was my finished mock-up, and I'm just measuring out distances to make sure it was even as it needed to do its rounding with a coil in towards the front.
What we got here is the big loop that's going to slowly, gradually turn into a smaller area. Here's its seam allowance, which I then need to mimic a seam allowance now on this side. So that when it rolls over, I have two seam allowances.
Now I have my finished piece with my seam allowance in it. We can now cut this out into our main fabrics, which I used a mesh organza for the inside piece, which will give it some volume. And then I had a prettier translucent organza that was more solid over it. So there's our first test piece. And it just needed a little bit more length, so I went in and added it. Now here's that chiffon that I'm adding over the top of that organza. So that chiffon is going to be the finalized translucent piece, and that's what the fins are going to be made of. So to make sure it had its volume, I then sewed the organza to the chiffon, so that way it was a little bit more stiff. And this thankfully was just sewn all around the edges because it just needed to be adhered to it like an interfacing. And then she also had some fin details, so I manually went in and added basting stitches across the chiffon for the waist fin to bring in those fins. So the main thing is you also want to make sure that your tension is very low when you're working with these delicate fabrics. So since I'm working with chiffon, I did not need it to pucker as I was sewing it. So making sure that the tension was lowered meant the fabric didn't slip, causing that seam puckering that we see sometimes. And then the finished piece of what it looks like when it is together with the organza. And then the finished piece of what it looks like with the fin details on it. So now we're going to close up the sides, so that way we have our nice tubes. And now same thing, we're gonna just sew it together. We're using a zigzag stitch again for this part because it is on the stretch fabric body for the tail. And now we're ready to attach it to the tail body. So since we gave it a seam allowance, we're just attaching seam allowance to seam allowance and are gonna piece together in the front to where it barely shows. And there it is with the fabric attached. This was the inspiration I had for how to do the fin bottom on the dress, kind of like how the Simplicity pattern had their skirt. It was just a circle skirt. So I initially took the circle skirt details, and for each part, I made sure that it was shorter in the center, so that way it had the pointed parts for the tail. And I spent forever cutting this out and drafting it because it was also supposed to be pleated. So once I have my entire semicircle cut out, I then taped it up and laid it over our chiffon fabric. And once that was all cut up, we then did a rolled hem on the chiffon, which then is ironed and pressed. And this is what it looks like with draping, and there it is. So it is pleated at the attached part, but it was not pleated throughout. So it was only pleated at the seam for the tail at the bottom. We then have our wig, which we did use in Arta Wigs Lutheran in red. I gave it some volume on the bangs because that's the main part we have to focus. I did a side swoop and I set the bangs exactly how I needed to, using the pins on my mannequin head, let it rest in the appropriate position as I hairsprayed it and let it sit overnight. The seashells were 3D printed by Mighty Mark Props. They were then spray painted. I then attached them together using this elastic, and the elastic is then used as the back bra part. There is also a centerpiece for the elastic holding it together, keeping it together around my neck with the transparent neck pieces so that way it stays haltered up. And that is my Ariel cosplay, everybody. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, please give it a like, a comment, and a subscribe would be great. See you next time!